Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell. There are some fields near Manchester, well known to the inhabitants as Green Hayes Fields, through which runs a public footpath to a little village about 2 miles distant. One afternoon, these fields were much thronged. It was an early May evening, the April of the poets, for heavy showers had fallen all the morning. Groups of merry and somewhat loud-talking girls, whose ages might range from 12 to 20, came by with a buoyant step. They were most of them factory girls. Their faces were not remarkable for beauty. The only thing to strike a passer-by was an acuteness and intelligence of countenance, which has often been noticed in a manufacturing population. There were also numbers of boys, or rather young men, rambling among these fields, ready to bandy jokes with anyone. Here and there came a sober, quiet couple, either whispering lovers or husband and wife, and if the latter, they were seldom unencumbered by an infant. Some time in the course of that afternoon, 2 working men met with friendly greeting at a stile. One was a thorough specimen of a Manchester man, born of factory workers, and himself bred up in youth and living in manhood among the mills. He was below the middle size and slightly made, and his wan, colourless face gave you the idea that in his childhood he had suffered from the scanty living consequent upon bad times. He was accompanied by his wife, who might without exaggeration have been called a lovely woman, although now her face was swollen with crying. She was far advanced in pregnancy. The friend whom they met was more handsome and less sensible-looking than the man I have just described. He was tenderly carrying a babe in arms, while his wife, a delicate, fragile-looking woman, bore another of the same age, little, feeble twins. The last-mentioned man was the first to speak. "Well, John, how goes it with you?" And in a lower voice he added, "Any news of Esther yet?" The wives greeted each other like old friends. "Come, women," said John Barton with tenderness. "You've both walked far enough. Sit you down here. Here's my pocket handkerchief to spread under you to save the gowns. And now, Mrs. Wilson, give me the baby. I may as well carry him while you talk and comfort my wife." These arrangements were soon completed, but as soon as Barton had turned his back upon his wife, his countenance fell. "Then you've heard nothing of Esther?" asked George Wilson. "No, there shan't, as I take it. My mind is she's gone off with somebody. My wife frets and thinks she's drowned herself, but I tell her, folks don't care to put on their best clothes to drown themselves." "I wonder she ever left you," observed his friend. "That's the worst of factory work for girls. They can earn so much when work is plenty that they can maintain themselves anyhow. My Mary shall never work in a factory." "Folks said you'd cast Esther off." "Folks always met one a deal worse than one is. She came many a time to our house after she left off living with us. This very last Sunday she came to drink a cup of tea with Mary, and that was the last time we set eyes on her. My Mary loved Esther next to me, and young Mary. Come, let's go back to 'em. Your old woman may have done her good." As they walked homewards, Wilson expressed a wish that they still were the near neighbours they once had been. "Still, our Alice lives in the cellar under number 14 in Barber Street, and if you'd only speak the word, she'd be with you in 5 minutes to keep your wife company." "Thank you kindly for your offer," was Barton's reply. In the middle of that night, a neighbour of the Bartons was roused from her sound sleep by a knocking. She opened the window and asked who was there. "Me, John Barton," answered he. "My missus is in labour. Step in while I run for th' doctor, for she's fearful bad." In less than 5 minutes the woman was standing by Mrs. Barton's bedside, relieving the terrified Mary. The doctor was very long in hearing the repeated rings at his night bell, and then he begged Barton just to wait while he dressed himself. "Is she so very bad?" asked he. "Worse. Much worser than ever I saw her before," replied John. No, she was not. She was at peace. The cries were still forever. John opened the latch door, and in 2 minutes was in the room where lay the dead wife, whom he had loved with all the power of his strong heart. He stood like one stupefied. The doctor questioned the neighbour in whispers, and then approaching Barton said, "You must go downstairs. This is a great shock, but bear it like a man." He went mechanically and sat down on the first chair. He had no hope. Mary heard the sobs of her father's grief, and stealing down the steps, she knelt by him and kissed his hand. "Child, we must be all to one another now she is gone," whispered he. "Leave me, and go to bed now." "Leave you, father?" "Aye, but thou must." Mary got up, kissed her father, and sadly went upstairs to the little closet where she slept. Barton had been roused by his daughter's entrance, both from his stupor and from his uncontrollable sorrow. Bitterly he thought of the shock his poor wife had so recently had. He hardened his heart against Esther forever. One of the good influences over John Barton's life had departed that night. His gloom and his sternness now became habitual instead of occasional. Between the father and the daughter, though, there existed in full force that mysterious bond which unites those who have been loved by one who is now dead and gone. Yet with all this, Mary had not her father's confidence in the matters which now began to occupy him. She was aware that he had joined clubs and become an active member of a trades union, but it was hardly likely that a girl of Mary's age should care much for the differences between the employers and the employed. At all times it is a bewildering thing to the poor weaver to see his employer removing from house to house, each one grander than the last, till he ends in building one more magnificent than all, or sells his mill to buy an estate in the country, while all the time the weaver, who thinks he and his fellows are the real makers of this wealth, is struggling on for bread for their children. And when he knows trade is bad, when he would bear and endure much without complaining, he is bewildered to see that all goes on just as usual with the mill owners. John Barton was a good, steady workman, but he spent all he got with the confidence of one who was willing and believed himself able to supply all his wants by his own exertions. So when his master suddenly failed, and all hands in that mill were turned back one Tuesday morning, with the news that Mr. Hunter had stopped, Barton had only a few shillings to rely on. But he had good heart of being employed at some other mill, and accordingly, before returning home, he spent some hours in going from factory to factory asking for work. But at every mill was some sign of depression of trade. Barton was out of work, living on credit. It was during this time his little son, the apple of his eye, fell ill of the scarlet fever. Everything, the doctor said, depended on good nourishment. Mocking words. Barton tried credit, but it was worn out. He thought it would be no sin to steal, but he could not get the opportunity in the few days the child lingered. Hungry himself, he stood at one of the shop windows where all edible luxuries are displayed: haunches of venison, Stilton cheeses, moulds of jelly, and then he returned home with a bitter spirit of wrath in his heart, to see his only boy a corpse. So while Mary took her own way, growing more spirited every day and growing in her beauty too, her father was chairman at many a trades union meeting, a friend of delegates, and ambitious of being a delegate himself, a chartist, ready to do anything for his order. But now times became good, and all these feelings were theoretical, not practical. His most practical thought was getting Mary apprenticed to a dressmaker. Mary's strong will and her ambition prompted her unwilling father to apply at all the first establishments, but high premiums were asked at all. Poor man. Disheartened and angry, he went home, and before night she had engaged herself as apprentice, so-called, though there were no deeds or indentures to the bond, to a certain Miss Simmons, milliner and dressmaker, where Mary was to work for 2 years without any remuneration, on consideration of being taught the business, and where afterwards she was to dine and have tea, with a small quarterly salary divisible into a minute weekly pittance. And Mary was satisfied, and seeing this, her father was contented too, although his words were grumbling and morose. Another year passed on. Esther was still mysteriously absent, and people had grown weary of wondering and began to forget. Barton still attended his club, and was an active member of a trades union. One day in the early winter time, when people were provided with warm, substantial gowns, not like soon to wear out, and when accordingly business was rather slack at Miss Simmons', Mary met Alice Wilson, coming home from her half-day's work at some tradesman's house. Mary and Alice had always liked each other, since Alice had first started visiting at the Bartons, and Alice ventured to ask if Mary would come in and take her tea with her that very evening. "You'll think it dull enough, to come just to sit with an old woman like me. But there's a tidy young lass as lives in the floor above. She's granddaughter to old Job Lee. Do come, Mary. I've a terrible wish to make you known to each other." And Alice made haste home and lighted the unwilling fire. A knock at the door. It was Margaret, the young workwoman who lived in the rooms above. She was a sallow, unhealthy, sweet-looking young woman. Her dress was humble and very simple. The old woman gave her a hearty greeting. "I cannot think what keeps Mary, Barton," said Alice. The truth was, Mary was dressing herself. Yes, to come to poor old Alice's. She put on her pretty new blue merino, made tight to her throat, and sallied forth to impress poor gentle Margaret. She certainly succeeded. After they had eaten some clap bread and talked on and on, there was a lull. Alice all at once recalled her duties as hostess. "Margaret, thou must let Mary hear thee sing. Margaret is a rare singer, and I know she can make me cry at any time by singing The Oldham Weaver. Do sing that, Margaret. There's a good lass." With a faint smile, as if amused at Alice's choice of a song, Margaret began. When she had finished and Alice's little speech of thanks was over, there was quiet enough to hear a fine, though rather quavering male voice going over again one or two strains of Margaret's song. "That's grandfather," exclaimed she. "I must be going, for he said he should not be at home till past 9. As the girls ran up the cellar steps together, Margaret said, "Just step in and see grandfather. I should like him to see you." Mary consented, and that night she made the acquaintance of two of the dearest people she ever saw in her life, Margaret and her grandfather, Job Lee. She told the history of the evening to her father, who was interested by her account, and curious to see and judge these people for himself. And so John introduced himself to Job, and Job took to visiting John at home. Mary and Margaret met often also, and grew in love one toward the other. Most of Mary's foibles and feelings were made known to Margaret, but not all. There was one cherished weakness still concealed. It concerned a lover, favoured by fancy. A gallant, handsome young man, but not beloved. Yet Mary hoped to meet him every day in her walks, blushed when she heard his name, and tried to think of him as her future husband. Alas, poor Mary, bitter woe did thy weakness work thee. She had other lovers. One or two would gladly have kept her company, but she held herself too high, they said. Jem Wilson, George's son and a friend of Mary's from childhood, said nothing, but loved on and on. He would not relinquish hope. It was towards the end of February, and a bitter black frost had lasted for many weeks. Mary hurried home one evening, just as daylight was fading, with her shawl held up to her mouth. So she did not perceive Margaret till she was close upon her at the very turning into the court. "Bless me, Margaret, is that you? Where are you bound to?" "To nowhere but your own house. That is, if you'll take me in. I've a job of work to finish tonight. Mourning clothes as must be in time for the funeral tomorrow." "Well, Margaret, you're right welcome, as you know."